The morning fog rolled across the grass airfield like a burial shroud, thick and cold and smelling of engine oil and wet earth. Hauptmann Werner Mollendorf stood outside the operations tent, smoking his third cigarette before breakfast, watching the ground crew wheel his Stuka into position. The Junkers Ju-87 looked tired, paint flaking from the inverted gull wings, oil stains streaking the cowling, fabric control surfaces patched with mismatched canvas. Like everything else in the Luftwaffe by late 1943, it was held together with improvisation and desperation. Werner was 34 years old, which made him ancient by fighter pilot standards. He'd flown Stukas over Poland, France, the Eastern Front, and North Africa. He'd watched younger men burn in their cockpits, seen entire Stuka gestuators wiped out by Spitfires and Yaks, and somehow he was still here, still breathing, still flying, still killing. His hands didn't shake anymore. That had stopped somewhere over Stalingrad. Mollendorf. Inside. Now. The voice belonged to Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, the wing commander, a gray-faced man whose Iron Cross seemed to weigh more with each passing month. Werner dropped his cigarette into the mud and followed him into the tent. The interior smelled of cigarette smoke, damp canvas, and the metallic tang of fear that accompanied every mission briefing. 3 men waited inside. Reinhardt. A Luftwaffe intelligence officer Werner had never seen before. Young, pale, with the kind of soft hands that had never touched a control stick. And a man in civilian clothes who didn't introduce himself and didn't need to. The sharp eyes, the stillness, the way he stood slightly apart from the others. Gestapo, or something worse. "Sit down, Hauptmann." Werner sat. The map on the table showed Norway, specifically the western coast, a maze of fjords and mountains that had swallowed more German aircraft than any amount of flak. A single red circle marked a location he didn't recognize, deep in a valley system north of Bergen. "You will fly alone tomorrow morning," Reinhardt said, his voice flat and mechanical. 0430 departure. Low-altitude approach. 1 bomb load, 2 500-kilo bombs. You will strike these exact coordinates. He tapped the map. You will not deviate. You will not abort unless your aircraft is physically incapable of flight. And you will not discuss this mission with anyone, including your ground crew. Werner leaned forward, studying the map. "What's the target?" Silence. The civilian spoke, his voice soft and precise. "That information is not necessary for mission completion." "Not necessary?" Werner looked at Reinhardt. "Herr Oberst, with respect, I need to know what I'm attacking. Industrial facility? Military installation? Is there flak? Are there fighters? What's there?" "The target is a structure," the intelligence officer interrupted, consulting a folder. "Stone construction. Approximately 50 meters long. No significant anti-aircraft defenses in the immediate area, but British fighters patrol the coast regularly. You'll approach from the northeast, following this valley system to avoid radar detection. Altitude no higher than 100 meters until final approach, then dive bomb from 1,000 meters. Werner's jaw tightened. "You want me to fly a Stuka, alone, into Norway, attack an unnamed target, and somehow make it back across 200 kilometers of open water where Beaufighters and mosquitoes are hunting anything with a swastika on it?" "Yes," the civilian said simply. "And if I'm shot down? If I'm captured? What do I tell the British?" "Nothing," Reinhardt said, and there was something in his tone that made Werner's skin crawl. "Because you know nothing. You received map coordinates. You followed orders. That's all." Werner looked at each man in turn. The intelligence officer avoided his eyes. Reinhardt stared at the map as if memorizing terrain he'd never see. The civilian watched Werner with the empty patience of a snake. "This is a volunteer mission," the civilian said. "You can refuse." It was a lie, and everyone in the tent knew it. Men who refused Gestapo requests didn't fly anymore. They didn't do anything anymore. When do I leave? Werner asked. 0430, Reinhardt repeated. Weather window closes at 0700. If you miss it, the mission is scrubbed. He paused. Permanently. The meeting ended. Werner walked back to his quarters through the fog, his mind racing. A stone building. 50 meters long. In the middle of nowhere. Important enough to send a veteran pilot on a suicide mission, but not important enough to tell him what he was destroying. He spent the rest of the day checking his aircraft, loading maps, calculating fuel weights and attack angles. His radio man, a kid named Becker who barely shaved, asked once where they were going. Werner told him to mind his own business and check the bomb releases again. When Becker walked away, Werner saw his hands were shaking. That night, Werner didn't sleep. He lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the barracks windows, thinking about stone buildings and secrets and the kinds of targets that couldn't be named. Somewhere in Norway, something waited in a valley, something important enough to kill for, important enough to die for, important enough that even knowing its name was forbidden. At 0415, he pulled on his flight suit, collected his maps, and walked toward the flight line. The Stuka sat in the darkness like a mechanical bird of prey, bombs already loaded, fuel tanks topped off. The ground crew chief saluted and handed him the sign-off sheet without speaking. Werner climbed into the cockpit. Behind him, Becker settled into the rear gunner's position, checking his MG-81 machine gun. The radio crackled to life. Ready for engine start, Herr Hauptmann. Werner looked east. The first gray light of dawn was bleeding into the sky, turning the fog silver. Somewhere beyond that horizon, beyond the North Sea and the Norwegian coast and the mountains and the fjords, a target waited. A target with no name. A target that would either make sense of this war or prove that nothing made sense anymore. He pressed the starter. The Jumo engine coughed, caught, roared to life. The propeller became a blur. The aircraft shook like something alive and angry. "Let's go see what we're not supposed to know about," Werner muttered, and released the brakes. The Stuka rolled forward into the darkness, carrying 2 bombs and 2 men toward a secret that couldn't be spoken. The North Sea looked like molten lead in the early dawn, flat and hostile and endless. Werner kept the Stuka 20 meters above the waves, low enough that spray occasionally misted the windscreen, high enough that a moment's inattention wouldn't send them cartwheeling into the water. The Jumo engine droned steadily, the sound hypnotic and dangerous. It made you drowsy, made you stop thinking, made you forget that every minute in the air brought you closer to something bad. Behind him, Becker was silent. The kid had figured out this wasn't a normal mission. Normal missions had targets, bridges, convoys, troop concentrations. Normal missions had briefings where officers pointed at reconnaissance photos and explained what you were killing and why. This mission had coordinates on a map and a civilian who wouldn't give his name. Werner checked his compass, adjusted course 2 degrees north. The Norwegian coast was 30 minutes ahead, invisible beyond the gray haze where sea met sky. No radio chatter. No other aircraft. Just the engine noise and the wind and the knowledge that he was flying toward something important enough that 5 different people had told him to forget about it. His hands moved automatically. Throttle adjustments, trim corrections, scanning instruments, checking fuel. 20 years of flying. Thousands of hours. He'd bombed Warsaw and Rotterdam and dozens of Soviet cities he couldn't even pronounce. He'd killed hundreds, maybe thousands of people he never saw. And he'd never once asked what gave anyone the right to tell him where to drop bombs. Until now. The coast appeared gradually, like something developing in a darkroom. First a darker smudge in the gray, then the definition of cliffs and rocks, then the sudden vertical reality of mountains rising from the sea. Werner pulled back on the stick, climbing to clear the coastal plateau, the Stuka's engine straining as altitude and weight fought against power. Behind him, Becker rotated his gun mount, scanning for fighters. "Nothing yet," Becker's voice crackled through the intercom. "But they're out here. I can feel it." Werner didn't answer. He was flying the valley approach now, following the map coordinates through a maze of rock and ice and scattered pine forests. The mountains rose on either side, close enough that he could see individual trees, the white threads of waterfalls, the scars where avalanches had torn through the forest. Flying valleys was dangerous. One wrong turn and you flew into a dead end with no room to turn around, just rock and death and nobody ever finding the wreckage. The coordinates led northeast, deeper into the mountains. Werner checked his watch. 15 minutes to target. The valley narrowed, then opened into a broader space where a river cut through the rock. He followed the water, staying low, the Stuka's shadow flickering across the ground below. The morning sun was rising behind him now, turning the fog gold, making the peaks glow like something from a children's story. It was beautiful. It was the kind of morning where you forgot about war and death and classified targets that couldn't be named. Then he saw the first sign that something was wrong. A village appeared ahead, small, maybe 20 buildings clustered around the river. Fishing boats tied to wooden docks. Smoke rising from chimneys. People. Civilians. Werner's stomach tightened. The coordinates placed his target 2 kilometers beyond the village, up the valley, which meant whatever he was bombing was close to population. Close enough that mistakes would kill families, not soldiers. Herr Hauptmann, Becker's voice was tense. There's something strange here. Look left. Werner banked slightly, following Becker's direction. Through the trees, barely visible, he saw what looked like power lines, heavy cables strung between metal towers, running parallel to the valley. Not normal for this far into the wilderness. Then he saw the road, not a dirt track but an actual paved road, winding up from the village toward the mountains. Roads like that cost money. They meant something important. The coordinates were close now. Werner climbed to attack altitude, circling once to orient himself. The valley opened into a small basin, maybe half a kilometer across. The river widened into a series of pools and rapids. Trees everywhere, thick pine forest that would make any bombing run difficult. And there, exactly where the coordinates indicated, was the target. A building. Stone construction, just like the intelligence officer had said. But not just any building. It was massive, low and industrial, with a flat roof and small windows. Smokestacks at one end. What looked like large pipes running from the building toward the river. And surrounding it, barely visible through the trees, the outline of fencing and guard towers. Werner felt ice in his chest. This wasn't a warehouse. This wasn't a supply depot. This was a factory. And factories this deep in occupied Norway, this heavily guarded, this carefully hidden, they made things that mattered. Things that changed wars. Things that killed thousands instead of dozens. His mind raced through possibilities. Weapons research, chemical production, something nuclear. He'd heard rumors, whispers in officers' messes about secret projects, about weapons that could level entire cities, about races against time and allied saboteurs and facilities that couldn't be mentioned. What is that? Becker whispered. What are we bombing? Werner didn't answer. He was already positioning for the attack run, climbing to 1,000 meters, the Stuka straining against the thin mountain air. The building sat below like something malignant, industrial and wrong in the pristine wilderness. Part of him wanted to abort, to turn back, to refuse to drop bombs on something he didn't understand. But he'd seen what happened to men who refused. He rolled into the dive. The world tilted vertical. The engine screamed. The dive brakes deployed with a metallic shriek, the famous Jericho siren that had terrified soldiers from Poland to Egypt. The building rushed toward him. Stone walls and a flat roof and tiny figures running below, scrambling for cover. Werner centered the target in his sight, his hand steady on the bomb release, counting altitude, counting seconds, his entire being focused on one moment, one decision. 500 meters. 400. 300. His thumb hovered over the release button. Something moved at the edge of his vision, another building, smaller, partially hidden. And outside it, in a fenced area, he saw people. Dozens of them. Workers in striped clothing. Prisoners. Civilian prisoners at a military target. Herr Hauptmann, Becker started. Werner pressed the release. The Stuka lurched upward as both bombs fell away. He pulled out of the dive, yanking the stick back, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, gray edges creeping into his vision. The engine howled. The altimeter unwound. The valley walls blurred past. Behind him, the bombs hit. 2 explosions, so close together they sounded like one. The shock wave buffeted the aircraft, throwing it sideways. Werner fought the controls, leveling out, climbing, getting altitude. He risked one glance back. The building was burning. One wall had collapsed inward. Smoke poured from the wreckage, black and thick and chemical. Secondary explosions rippled through the structure. Something inside was catching fire, something that burned hot and angry. The prisoners' compound was untouched, but the people inside were screaming, running, chaos spreading like infection. And then Werner saw the water. The river downstream from the facility was changing color. Something dark was flowing from the damaged building, mixing with the current, spreading. Within seconds, the water turned gray-brown, then darker. Fish floated to the surface, dead. The water itself seemed to be smoking. Gott im Himmel, Becker breathed. What did we just do? Werner didn't know. But he knew one thing. Whatever was in that building, it was poisonous. And now it was in the water. Flowing downstream. Toward the village. Toward the people he'd seen smoking their morning cigarettes and tending their fishing boats. He leveled the Stuka, heading west toward the coast, following the valley back toward the sea. Behind him, the smoke column rose higher, darker, a marker visible for kilometers. Below, the poisoned water flowed toward innocent people who didn't even know a war was happening above their heads. Werner's hands were shaking now. Not from fear. Not from adrenaline. From the realization that he'd just done something unforgivable, and he didn't even know what it was. Werner held the Stuka in a climbing turn, heading west, when Becker's voice cut through the intercom like a razor. Fighters. 3 o'clock high. Werner's head snapped right. 2 dark shapes were dropping out of the sun, fast and angular. Even at this distance, he recognized the distinctive twin-boom silhouette, RAF mosquitoes. Fast, deadly, and equipped with 20mm cannons that could tear a Stuka apart in seconds. Hold on. Werner shoved the throttle forward and dove for the valley floor, the Jumo engine screaming. The mosquitoes followed, rolling into pursuit formation. Tracer fire stitched the air to his left, bright lines of death that missed by meters. Becker opened up with his MG-81, the gun chattering desperately, more to mark their position than actually hit anything. Mosquitoes were too fast, too maneuverable. A Stuka running from them was like a wounded duck trying to outfly hawks. Werner threw the aircraft into the valley mouth, flying so low that pine branches whipped past the canopy. The mountains rose on either side, no room to maneuver, nowhere to hide. Just rock and trees and the narrow corridor of air between. Behind him, the mosquitoes split up, one going high, one staying low. Tactics. They'd done this before. Hundreds of times. Another burst of cannon fire, this time closer. Something hit the tail section with a metallic bang. The Stuka shuddered but kept flying. Werner yanked the stick left, following a bend in the valley, the wingtip clearing the rock face by less than 5 meters. His heart hammered. His mouth was desert dry. The mosquito behind him was closing, its engine roar growing louder. He's right on us. Becker screamed, still firing. I can't. The cannon fire caught them. 20mm shells punched through the Stuka's tail like hammers through paper. Metal shrieked. Something exploded behind Werner. He didn't know what, couldn't look, could only keep flying. The control stick went sluggish in his hands. The rudder cables were damaged, maybe severed. Blood appeared on his left arm. Shrapnel, probably, he couldn't feel it yet. The aircraft was dying beneath him, piece by piece. Werner saw the village ahead, the same fishing village from earlier, the one downstream from the facility. Smoke was visible even from here. People in the streets, pointing at the water, at the fish, at whatever poison was flowing toward them from the bombed facility. The second mosquito came in from above, diving vertical. Werner saw it coming, saw the gun flashes, heard Becker's scream cut off in mid-sound. The rear canopy shattered. The MG-81 went silent. "Becker!" Werner shouted. No answer. "Becker!" Nothing. Just wind howling through the shattered canopy and the terrible silence of a man who'd stopped existing. Werner was alone now, flying a crippled aircraft with one dead crewman and 2 British fighters hunting him like dogs after a rabbit. The coast was still 15 kilometers away. Might as well have been 1,000. The Stuka started losing altitude. Not dramatically, just a slow, inevitable descent that no amount of throttle could stop. Hydraulics failing, probably. Or control surface damage. Werner didn't have time to diagnose. He was too busy trying to stay alive for the next 30 seconds. The valley opened into fjord country. Steep cliffs dropping into the sea, narrow inlets of gray water, nowhere to land, nowhere to hide. The mosquitoes came in again, confident now, taking their time. They knew he was finished. This was just cleanup. Werner made a decision. He aimed for the fjord ahead, a narrow inlet with steep walls and deep water. No beach, no shallows, just 100 meters of stone cliff and then the sea. He reduced throttle, extended flaps, trying to control the descent. The Stuka was wallowing now, flying like it was half-drunk, every control input a negotiation with physics and broken machinery. Werner reached the top of the cliff just as dusk began to fall. His hands were raw, his flight suit torn, the shrapnel wound in his arm crusted with dried blood. He collapsed in the scrub grass above the fjord, gasping, his body screaming for rest it couldn't have. Below, the water was dark and still, hiding the wreckage and Becker's body in cold, permanent silence. He'd been lucky. A Norwegian fisherman had seen the crash from a distance and, instead of reporting it to the local garrison, had pointed Werner toward a shepherd's trail that led away from the coast. Why? Werner didn't know. Maybe the old man had seen enough of the war. Maybe he just didn't want more German boots trampling through his village. Or maybe he'd seen the poisoned river and understood, on some level, that Werner was running from the same people who'd caused it. Werner followed the trail east, moving slowly in the gathering darkness. Every sound made him freeze, expecting German patrols, Norwegian resistance, British commandos. But the mountains were empty. Just wind and rock and the occasional cry of a bird. He was alone in a way he'd never been before, even in the crowded skies over Stalingrad. By midnight, he found an abandoned hunting cabin, roof half collapsed, door hanging on one hinge, but shelter. He crawled inside, pulled moldy blankets over himself, and tried to sleep. Instead, he lay awake staring at the darkness, seeing Becker's face, the burning facility, the people in the village clutching their stomachs as the poisoned water worked its way through their systems. In the morning, reality settled in. He was an enemy pilot in occupied territory with no papers, no weapon, no plan. He couldn't go back, walking into a German garrison and explaining he'd been shot down after bombing a classified target would mean interrogation, probably execution. The civilians in Berlin didn't tolerate questions about secret facilities. But he couldn't go forward either. Norway was crawling with Wehrmacht units, Gestapo informants, and Norwegian collaborators. One word to the wrong person and he'd disappear into a cell where even his bones would be classified. So Werner stayed in the mountains, moving at night, scavenging what he could, watching the valley from high ridges. Over the next week, he saw the full consequences of what he'd done. The village downstream was evacuated. German troops in hazmat suits cordoned off the river. Medical trucks arrived, then departed carrying covered bodies. Werner counted them from a distance, 17 bodies in 5 days. Men, women, children, poisoned by whatever had been in those pipes, whatever chemicals had mixed with the water when his bombs struck. On the 8th day, engineers arrived with bulldozers. They demolished what remained of the facility, buried the rubble, and covered everything with concrete. Then they left. No plaques, no markers, just a smooth gray scar in the valley where the building had been, as if nothing had ever existed there at all. Werner understood then. Whatever the facility had produced, weapons components, chemical agents, something worse, it was finished now. The British had probably been hunting it for years. His bombing hadn't been about destroying production. It had been about erasing evidence, making sure that when the Allies finally took Norway, they'd find nothing but an empty valley and a concrete pad that could have been anything. The prisoners he'd seen in the compound were gone too. Werner never learned where. Probably shot and buried in unmarked graves, loose ends tied up, witnesses eliminated. The Reich was efficient about such things. By the end of the second week, Werner had made his decision. He couldn't go back to Germany, not to the Luftwaffe, not to the chain of command that had sent him here. But he couldn't surrender to the Allies either. Not yet. Not until he understood what he'd destroyed and whether the men who'd ordered it had been protecting Germany or covering up something darker. He started moving south, traveling at night, stealing food from farms, avoiding all contact. He had no plan except survival and the gnawing need to know what that stone building had been. What had been worth Becker's life? Worth 17 villagers' lives? Worth the contamination of a river that would take decades to heal? 3 weeks later, Werner reached Sweden. The border was porous in the mountains, smugglers' trails, unguarded passes, places where neither Wehrmacht nor Swedish patrols ventured. He crossed on a moonless night, walked until dawn, then surrendered to the first Swedish border guard he found. The interrogation was professional. Swedish intelligence wanted to know about aircraft deployments, Luftwaffe strength, Eastern Front operations. Werner told them everything except the mission. That he kept to himself. Some secrets were too dangerous even for neutral countries. They interned him at a camp near Stockholm, not unpleasant, mostly German airmen and sailors who'd ended up on the wrong side of the border. Werner spent his days reading Swedish newspapers, learning about the war's progress, watching the Third Reich crumble one defeat at a time. He spent his nights thinking about stone buildings and unanswered questions. The war ended in May 1945. Werner was released 2 months later, repatriated to what was left of Germany. He went to his hometown, or what remained of it, and found rubble, refugees, and no one who cared about a Stuka pilot with questions about classified facilities in Norway. He spent the next 5 years digging. Official records were destroyed, but Werner was patient. He found men who'd worked in procurement, engineers who'd designed bunkers and weapons plants, intelligence officers who'd managed classified programs. Piece by piece, he assembled the truth. The facility in the valley had been a heavy water production plant. One of several the Reich had built to support nuclear weapons research. The Allies had destroyed most of them. Commando raids, sabotage, bombing. But this one had survived until 1943, hidden in the mountains, protected by secrecy rather than flak guns. Werner's attack had been ordered after British intelligence learned its location. Not by the Luftwaffe. By someone higher. Someone who decided that destroying the evidence was more important than explaining why. The prisoners had been political detainees, Norwegians, Poles, Russians, worked until they were used up, then disposed of. The villagers downstream had been collateral damage. Acceptable losses in a war where acceptable had lost all meaning. Werner never found the civilian from the briefing. Probably dead, probably in one of the mass graves at Bergen-Belsen or Dachau where men who knew too much ended up. The intelligence officer had vanished into Soviet-occupied East Germany. Oberst Reinhardt had eaten his pistol in April 1945, 3 days after Hitler's death. Becker's family received a death certificate stating he'd been killed in action over the North Sea. No details. No explanations. Just another name on the long list of men who died following orders. Werner lived another 40 years. He never flew again. Never spoke about the mission except once, in 1973, to a historian researching Norwegian resistance operations. The historian promised to keep Werner's identity secret until after his death. Werner agreed. He died in 1989, 2 months before the Berlin Wall fell. In his desk, investigators found a folder containing maps, newspaper clippings, and a handwritten note. To whom it may concern, I bombed a target in Norway in 1943. I was told it was necessary. I was told not to ask questions. I followed orders, and 17 innocent people died because of it. I don't know if the mission was justified. I don't know if destroying that facility saved lives or cost them. I only know that obedience without understanding is not duty. It is cowardice. And I have been a coward for 46 years. May God forgive me. May Becker forgive me. May the people in that valley, whose names I never learned, forgive me. I cannot forgive myself. The folder was filed away in a university archive. The story of the nameless facility was published in an academic journal that almost no one read. The families of the 17 villagers never learned what had killed their loved ones. The official records still say industrial accident. The valley in Norway is peaceful now. The concrete pad is overgrown with moss and small trees. The river runs clear. It took 30 years, but nature healed what men had poisoned. Hikers pass through sometimes, taking photographs, unaware that beneath their feet lies the wreckage of secrets that nations spent blood to protect and blood to destroy. And at the bottom of a fjord, rusted and silent, the remains of a Ju-87 Stuka hold the body of a young man who died without knowing why. His name was George Becker. He was 19 years old. He liked motorcycles and his mother's cooking and the girl who lived 3 houses down from his family in Cologne. He followed orders. He trusted his pilot. He died believing he was serving his country. Werner Mollendorf knew better. And it killed him more slowly than any bullet could have. Some targets can't be named. Some missions can't be explained. And some questions don't have answers that make the asking worthwhile. But Werner asked anyway. Because he had to. Because someone had to. Because the alternative, blind obedience to classified authority, was a darkness deeper than any war could create. In 1943, a Stuka bombed a target that no one was allowed to name. The bombs fell. The facility burned. The river poisoned. The men died. And the only question that mattered, why, was buried deeper than any bunker, sealed tighter than any secret, and forgotten more completely than any of the men who'd paid the price for keeping it. That was how wars were fought. That was how wars were lost. And that was how men like Werner Mollendorf learned that sometimes the worst thing you can do is exactly what you're told.